So
Yeah, let's wipe that off.
as we jump in here on both sides of these covenants, obviously a covenant is a two-way promise. And so I love what Taylor's talking about with the Abrahamic covenant. The thing that is getting emphasized is God's faithfulness, and with the Mosaic covenant are these commandments and these things that people have to do. One phrase to watch for as you read the scriptures, and this is in the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Book of Mormon. For me, the essence of all covenant, because covenant is this connection with God between us and Him. Watch for the phrase, I'll just draw it like a nutshell, because this is the nutshell definition of all these covenants that we make. It's where He says, I will be your God, and you will be my people.
That's a great insight.
That's the essence of the covenant, of any covenant, is this God in heaven saying, look, I will take care of you. I will treat you like a God treats His people, but you have to treat me like your God. You have to love me, you have to have faith in me, you have to come to me and rely on me. And that is the only safety is in that covenant. Consequently, you'll hear other scriptures be used in sometimes almost combative or threatening ways. Scriptures such as, wickedness never was happiness. The reality is that's not a threat, and that shouldn't be used as a club. That's simply a statement of truth. Wickedness never was happiness. Why? It's because you've no longer said, I want you to be my God. You've said, I want something else that this world has to offer to be my God. And none of those things can treat you like God can treat you. There's no happiness. There's no enduring joy that can flow from anything that the world offers you as a counterfeit to the true covenant connection in the safety of being with God as His people. So Isaiah is going to constantly be helping us understand this. What happens is people will come to the Book of Mormon. If you stop and think about this for a minute, what are the sections in the Book of Mormon that people most often either skip or glaze over and just kind of blah, 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 blah. I'll get to the end. Okay, let's pick up the story. Which sections?
Oh, I know.
Which sections?
Isaiah.
It's Isaiah, or where Jesus is giving a speech about the house of Israel in 3rd Nephi, or Zenos is giving a long allegory about the house of Israel and the covenant connection. It's interesting because wherever the scriptures start talking about covenant and house of Israel, if we're not careful, we zone out and call it boring, when in reality, it's God setting up the terms of this connection that we have with Him. It's really, really important, but it's not on a silver platter for us. You have to dig, you have to pay attention, you have to do more than just read black words on a white page. So, look at this. If you take the book of Isaiah, I'm going to leave that there for a minute. If you take the book of Isaiah, there's a simple way to divide out Isaiah. You can just divide it into half. Chapters 1 through 39 is the first segment of Isaiah. And chapter 40 through 66 is the second segment of Isaiah. This whole opening segment is God speaking to Israel in sometime around between the 740 and 701 BC, so 100 to 140 years before Lehi comes into the story. Israel has gone through this pattern so many times, the pride cycle, if you will, from the Book of Mormon, where they've suffered, they've been humble, they've repented, God has blessed them, reestablished the covenant. They're like, okay, yeah, we're yours, we'll worship you now.
And then they forget.
Or they get prosperous and willingly go after other gods and they leave the covenant. You'll notice God's never the one leaving the covenant. He's spending a lot of time going around finding them to reestablish the covenant, but He's never leaving it. They're the ones who leave it. So they do this over and over and over and over again, and finally you get to Isaiah, and the first 39 chapters are 39 chapters of consequences of this is what happens when you repeatedly break my connection with you, when you treat me as if I'm not your God.
And what's interesting about this is that when we don't show our loyalty to God, He is covenantally obligated to bring forth, well, the opposite of blessings. And let me just give a brief metaphor about this. If you rent a home or you have a mortgage, you have made an agreement with the landlord, okay? So if you're a renter, there's a landlord who owns the property. If it's a mortgage, the bank actually owns the property, so they're the landlord. And there's certain obligations that you are required to fulfill. And if you actually decide to break those expectations that the landlord has placed on the land or on the home or on the bank note for the mortgage, what do you think is going to happen? If you are consistently breaking the agreement that you made with the landlord or the bank, eventually they will kick you out of the house and off the land. And what happens to the people of Israel? They don't show loyalty to God. Remember, God revealed the instructions for loyalty. It's the 10 Commandments. Like, love God, love your neighbor. And if you don't do those things, you're off the land. And why do the 10 tribes get taken into captivity? They broke the covenant. They're off the land.
And they were warned and warned and warned, and they refused. They refused to come back to the covenant. So understand that the book of Isaiah is way more complex than this. This is a really, really simple look to separate it out, to make it a little easier to digest. The fascinating thing is the second half shows God's mercy, His love, His compassion, His long-suffering. So this is, all of these chapters are messages of hope and deliverance, even though these people don't deserve it. They don't deserve deliverance. They don't deserve love, but they get it anyway because God made a promise to Abraham.
And that's His grace and His mercy. And that Abrahamic covenant, God promised to always offer grace and love to His people. And if we turn away from it, the grace doesn't go away, the love doesn't go away. We just have walked away from it. Yeah. And He's just saying, hey, everybody, it's still here. Come back to me, and I will give you all these things. It's freely available.
Now, some of you are probably wondering at this point, why are you spending so much time on this? I thought our scripture block was 2 Nephi chapter 6 through 10. The reality is you can't really understand what's going on in chapter 6, 7, 8, and then Jacob's commentary in 9 and 10, unless you understand the context of why Jacob's using Isaiah and what he's trying to do with Isaiah to convince his people. His people are struggling. They're wandering, and he's trying to pull them back into the covenant. And he's going to quote to them chapters 50, 51, and first two verses of chapter 52 here in a minute, which is leading up to the center point of this hope and deliverance of God keeping these covenants. The fascinating thing is the hope and the deliverance it culminates in chapters 52 through 54, where you get these allusions to this suffering servant who's going to come and be punished and take upon him all of our transgressions, all of our breakages of the law, to allow it so that that covenant can be reestablished. It's all about the atonement of Jesus Christ, which, if we don't understand that, then again, all we're going to be doing is reading black words on a white page when we come to 2 Nephi 6 through 10. Let me show you one other thing here. One reason, among many, why people struggle with Isaiah is they'll read him in the Book of Mormon in isolation. So we often get into the habit, because of the way the book is laid out, we'll read a chapter a day, or we'll focus on one chapter at a time. And when we do that, we miss some of the overarching beauty of how the book was put together. Because when Jacob or Nephi or Alma or Helaman, when they wrote the book, and when Mormon put it together and abridged it, he didn't use chapters and verses the way we have them. He didn't do that. He did have chapters, no verses, but those chapters are much bigger. And it would be worth some effort for you, if you want to look into that, to look at the original 1830 edition, how the chapters were broken out, and you'll find out, oh, this author intended for all of our current chapters to be read together as one unit or one whole. It'll change the way you look at some of these chapters.
And actually, just briefly about that, Book of Mormon Central has, with the authorization of the church, created a new scripture reading experience called Scripture Plus. It's available on any mobile device. And we actually have the 1830 edition, I just pulled it up right here, where it is broken up into the paragraph formatting. So you can read the LDS 2013 edition. We also have a Book of Mormon Central edition with red lettering. But if you want to do what Tyler suggested, we have this free app. You can download it and look at actually how the Book of Mormon was structured originally when it flowed from the pen of Oliver Cowdery and the lips of Joseph Smith. Beautiful.
Now, one other overview perspective here, and then we're going to dive in. There's a big difference between a Hebrew worldview and a perspective of who we are and identity, and a Greek perspective. The Hebrew people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the house of Israel, all of them, Moses, all of that group, all the way down into Jesus' time, the Hebrew people instinctively identify themselves at the group level or at the family level. There's a high sense of identity attached to my family, my tribe. My identity comes because I am of the house of Israel in this larger world. The Greeks come along and take over the world, and they flip that on its head. For the Greeks, it's all about democracy. It's all about every man for himself. Everybody is an individual identity, and so they find their identity more so at the individual local level, regardless of what's going on out there. When you read scriptures, notice that the Old Testament and the New Testament and much of the Book of Mormon is written from this perspective, where your identity comes by coming into the house of Israel, coming into the covenant family.
Being a child of Abraham.
Child of Abraham. We live now in the 21st century in a Greek-dominated world. We can thank the Greeks. I mean, without them, we wouldn't have all the freedoms and all of the opportunities politically and business and culturally and with the arts and learning. We have a lot of things to thank them for. So when you read your scriptures, notice that it's written from this perspective, but you can feel free to take them personally. So while we're talking about Isaiah referring to the house of Israel and the family and this group identity, that's good, and we're not taking that away. We would never want to take that away, because that's how it was given in its original context. I guess our point is, don't forget that you can take that one step to liken all scriptures unto yourself, bring them down off of the higher umbrella level, bring them down to the eye level, if you will. They're easier to see there and to relate to you, your family, your situation in your immediate situation.
Circumstances. So what we're going to do is talk about the structure of 2 Nephi 6 through 10 so you can see what's going on here.
Yeah, because once again, if we're not careful, what we'll do is we'll just read one chapter in isolation today and then be confused, put it on the shelf, come back tomorrow, read another one, be confused, and then come back the next day and we might come across, oh, okay, now I understand this one, but we haven't benefited from looking at them the way the original prophet put them down as one whole. So here's what happens. Whenever you get Isaiah quoted in the Book of Mormon, try not to get into the trap of just reading it completely in isolation, because the prophets never package Isaiah in isolation. they put a nice little border around him. So you always watch for what they say as an introduction. They're going to give you a rationale, a reason. They're not just writing along or teaching the people and all of a sudden say, okay, pause, and then pull out Isaiah and start reading it to them. They don't do that. There's a reason they're going to Isaiah, and they usually tell you why they're doing that here in the chapter or chapters right before.
So, as a parenting technique, if I actually gave my kids an introduction of why I'm lecturing them with Isaiah, they would receive it better. But I'm just jumping right in.
There you go. Especially if at the end you give them your prophetic or parental commentary.
Right.
So when prophets quote prophets, whether in a general conference setting in our day or in a scriptural setting, they have some authority from the Lord to tell you what they got out of those chapters. Well, that's exactly what you get here in this Come Follow Me section for this week. We get chapter 6. This is all in 2 Nephi. Chapter 6, Jacob is going to introduce why he wants to go to Isaiah and why Nephi asked him to read these particular chapters. Jacob's on assignment from his presiding authority in this case, and he tells you that. So he's going to give you some heads up here, some look for this. Then he gives you the Isaiah chapters that he's going to quote, which are 50, 51, and the first two verses of chapter 52. Then he gives you his commentary. So if you struggle reading chapters 7 and 8, just pay attention to some of these and you're going to say, oh, that helps me unlock some of the meaning of these more difficult to understand words and phrases and passages.
And let's talk about a few of these. And we've talked about the covenants, the house of Israel. These are all major and crucial themes for understanding why Jacob, why Nephi, well, first of all, why Isaiah preached these things, and then why Jacob and Nephi repeated the words of Isaiah and then explained them to their people. And I want to go back to something you said a little bit ago about how God gave us a covenantal community. Now in the modern world, we live in this individualistic society. It's all about me. It's all about me. And we actually, as members of the church, are part of a covenantal community. And that's what the invitation here is, to see the covenantal community that God has established, is inviting us into. And the word church comes from the ancient Greek word ekklesia. It literally means those who are called out from the world to join into a covenantal community. And God is trying to remind his people, remember the Abrahamic covenant is God's duty and his loyalty to us. He's trying to remind them of his love, his mercy, his kindness, because they've been kind of drifting away from him. And we imagine even Nephi's people, maybe they're starting to feel like worried, like, do we still have God's love? Maybe they've been struggling in some way. And listen to what we hear from the words of Isaiah, chapter 7 of 2 Nephi. He begins with saying, "Yea, for thus saith the Lord, have I put thee away, or have I cast thee off forever?" It's a rhetorical question. The answer is no, but he's trying to get the people to think about, like, I haven't left you. If you're feeling sad or lonely or feeling like you're not experiencing my blessings, why not turn back to me? I'm still here. I'm still waiting to be with you. I want you to be my people. And he goes on, "For thus saith the Lord, where is the bill of your mother's divorcement? To whom have I put thee away? Or to which of my creditors have I sold you? Yea, to whom have I sold you?" And he goes on and says, "Behold, for your iniquities have you sold yourselves, and for your transgressions is your mother put away."
So it's this idea of, in that covenant, I will be your God, you will be my people. That verse is example after example after example of, I never do this.
Yeah.
It's always you who are doing this. I never gave you a divorce. I never told you I'm done with you. I'm sick of you. I'm tired of you.
I never kicked you out of the land.
I don't do that.
But you walked out of the land because of your transgressions, or more appropriately, or to be more specific, your transgressions meant I had to let you go. But I want to bring you back in. Please come back. Yeah. And this is always what God is offering. And I want to tie it into our day. Our sacrament service is a replication of the Passover meal where God saved his people. And just like the Israelites partook of the blood and flesh of the Lamb, we do the same thing. And that's actually a covenantal reunion where the people pledge themselves to be God's people. And when we make that covenant every single week, we're saying, I'm going to be yours, God. And what does he give us in return? You'll have my presence.
And isn't that amazing how God does that in a sacrament setting where you combine the best of the Hebrew mindset with the best of the Greek mindset?
Yeah.
You gather as a group, you come in families and as a ward family to partake of those emblems as a group, and that identity as a group, but you partake of those elements as an individual, one by one. You're making that individual covenant. I think it's beautiful how God's doing that, to the point where the very verse you read out of chapter 7, we know that Isaiah is talking about the house of Israel, this big group. We get that. But the reality is at the individual or Greek mindset level, it's also true. You can have an entire family who's covenant keeping and they're doing everything right, and one individual say, I don't want him to be my God anymore. I want to go and do this other stuff. And they forsake the covenant. They leave the faith, so to speak. And the same exact thing can be said of that individual. Is God saying to that individual, here's a writing of my divorcement, I'm done with you? No. So he treats us collectively and individually with this complete love and covenant-keeping perspective.